Anyone could laugh at Don Rickles. Frank Sinatra, Hollywood stars, and even presidents. However, Johnny Carson stands out as his most memorable stage colleague. Their chemistry lighted up The Tonight Show night after night. And it appeared to the outside world to be a friendship based on trust and laughing. However, everything changed when Carson left late one night in 1992. Rickles never received what he believed he had been promised. And the ensuing resentment would plague him for years. Rickles finally told the unimaginable truth about Johnny Carson before he passed away. The ascent to prominence of Don Rickles. Making people laugh when they least expect it, timing and delivery have always been key components of comedy. And two guys, Don Rickles and Johnny Carson, were at the top of the globe during the heyday of television. Each of them made a lasting contribution to humor. They appeared to be best buddies on screen, making America laugh night after night while taunting one another. However, the reality of their connection was far more nuanced. And Don Rickles finally spoke the truth about it before he passed away. Don Rickles was born on May 8, 1926. He was the man who could make political leaders and movie stars laugh more than anybody else in the room by insulting them. Born to Jewish immigrant parents in Queens, New York. Was raised in the Jackson Heights neighborhood, where Yiddish culture and language were ingrained in daily life. Don once claimed that his Jewish heritage had influenced his sense of humor and wit, as well as provided him with the incisive edge that audiences would come to adore. Rickles' life was disrupted by World War II, just like the lives of many young men in his time. He joined the U.S. Navy in 1944 at the age of 18, serving on board the motor torpedo boat tender USS Cyrene. Despite not experiencing direct combat, he was impacted by the Navy's discipline and camaraderie. It also allowed him to reflect on his goals for his life after he got back home. Rickles realized he wanted to be an actor by the time the war ended. In New York, he enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, among the nation's most prestigious acting schools. He put in a lot of effort in the hopes of landing major parts in TV or movies. However, the reality was that acting was not an easy task. His fury began to grow as he was consistently rejected. At last, Rickles made the decision to attempt something new in his early 50s. He started doing stand-up. He did it as a means of staying on stage, not because he wanted to be a comedian. To engage with an audience and perform. He tried common jokes at first, but they didn't achieve the effect he was after. Rickles didn't discover his hallmark act until one day, when some hecklers broke it up. He retaliated with scathing accusations, but instead of upsetting the crowd, it caused the house to collapse. People adored it. They actually found his comebacks more hilarious than his prepared content. At that point, Don Rickles realized he had a genuine talent. With practice, he became proficient in this insult comedy approach. Punchlines and lengthy tales were not the focus of his show. The goal was to tear into whoever was present. It wasn't cruel, though. That was Rickles' magic. He could make someone feel like they were part of the joke even if he was insulting them in the most severe way. His entire career would be defined by that equilibrium. His life was profoundly altered by that style one night on Miami Beach. The most influential performer in the nation, Frank Sinatra, was seated in the audience. Rickles immediately recognized him. "Make yourself at home, Frank," he replied, glancing directly at Sinatra. "Strike someone." The room exploded. Even though Sinatra was known for being harsh, a young comic dared to make fun of him. Sinatra adored it. He immediately became Rickles' staunchest ally, telling his contacts in the entertainment industry about him. The doors of Las Vegas were opened by that endorsement. Rickles rose to prominence, performing for large audiences and gaining the monikers Mr. Warmth and, paradoxically, the Merchant of Venom. The duality of his deed was encapsulated in those names. Warmth in attitude, but venom in delivery. People came to be roasted by Don Rickles personally, not just to laugh. His career in television took off from there. On talk shows like the Dean Martin Celebrity Roasts, he would frequently make fun of celebrities from a wide range of backgrounds, including actors, politicians, and even athletes, and somehow managed to make everyone smile. He was more than just a stand-up comedian, though. Rickles was extremely successful in movies and television. Prior to his role in the late 1970s sitcom CPO Sharkey, he starred in The Don Rickles Show, a brief sitcom that demonstrated his keen timing. Additionally, he starred with Burt Lancaster and Clark Gable in films like Run Deep and Run Silent, demonstrating his ability to handle serious acting when given the opportunity. And he continued to receive recognition into his elder years. For the documentary Mr. Warmth: The Don Rickles Project, which honored his life and career, he received an Emmy Award in 2007. It was a worthy homage to a guy who had shaped comedy for decades and impacted innumerable performers who followed in his footsteps. However, Rickles rarely discussed the other side of his tale in public, despite the laughter, TV appearances, and friendships with Hollywood celebrities. The hidden pain of Rickles. Don Rickles made a living by making people laugh. But his narrative was much different when he was not in the spotlight. The audiences witnessed the unending energy, the broad smiles, and the swift comebacks. They were not always aware of Rickles' private life, which was full of heartache and happiness. He experienced intense personal sorrow as well as times of affection. When Rickles married Barbara Sklar in 1965, his life took a drastic turn. He used to quip that she was the reason he had survived all those years in show business. Barbara was more than just his spouse. His anchor was her. They also have 2 kids together, Larry and Mindy. Despite not always being the most outspoken man at home, according to his own daughter, Don adored being a parent. According to Mindy Rickles, her father was incredibly affectionate but emotionally reserved. She clarified that although Don could make the world laugh and joke about, he repressed the want to share his innermost thoughts. That was one aspect of Rickles' secret personality. The same man who could boldly mock a celebrity in front of 1,000 people frequently found it difficult to express his own weaknesses to his family. She did clarify, though, that he was the ideal husband and father in spite of this. She described him as a very devoted father. He never made fun of us. Larry Rickles, his son, went into showbiz in a different direction. Larry started working as a producer and writer. Additionally, he received an Emmy Award in 2007 for his work on the Don Rickles Project, Mr. Warmth. For Don, who frequently claimed that his family's achievements meant more to him than his own, it was a proud occasion. However, catastrophe struck only 3 years later. Larry tragically passed away from pneumonia in 2011 at the age of 41. Although Don Rickles had built his entire career on humor, the anguish of losing a kid was indescribable. Rickles was completely devastated, and although he didn't discuss it in public, his loved ones saw a shift. His humor was still there, but it was veiled by something more serious. He spent the remainder of his life grieving over Larry's passing. Rickles valued his friendships with many celebrities, but they weren't without their problems, so it wasn't the sole burden. Throughout the years, there were rumors and whispers that Rickles had complex feelings for Frank Sinatra, the guy who had initially made him famous. Rickles never acknowledged all of the rumors in public, but according to some reports, he occasionally showed animosity towards the singer. The most startling aspect of these rumors was the claim that Sinatra had a sinister part in the tragic tale of Marilyn Monroe. These allegations claim that Rickles thought Sinatra had taken advantage of Monroe in Hollywood. Although Rickles never publicly uttered these contentious statements in front of cameras, they had a long-lasting effect on his standing in Hollywood. He was Mr. Warmth to the globe. The guy who couldn't get away with insulting people. However, in his personal life, he carried regrets, anguish, and opinions that weren't always consistent with how people perceived him. Rickles never let the audience see him falter in spite of these personal challenges. Every time he took the stage, he exuded confidence and was prepared to share his incisive humor. However, a different character would soon enter his story in a way that would shape a large portion of his career. Carson, Johnny. The titan of late-night television became into his most complex buddy as well as his best ally. Although their on-screen connection was evident, their friendship behind the scenes was characterized by more than simply laughs. The Tonight Show era Don Rickles had no idea that his appearance on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show would turn out to be one of the most pivotal moments in his career when he first appeared on the stage in 1965. Initially a guest appearance, it swiftly evolved into a regular role as the ultimate wildcard, not as a presenter or performer. Over the years, Rickles became one of Carson's most regular guests, making over 100 appearances, many of which were memorable, unplanned, and unpredictable. Because Carson and Rickles' connection was based on contrast, it worked. Johnny Carson was poised, composed, and well-timed. He was the greatest straight man actor in television history. In contrast, Rickles was a mess. Bold, outspoken, and never scared to express what others were too polite to even consider. They worked together to create magic. In addition to listening to Carson's speeches, viewers at home watched to see what would happen when Don Rickles was let loose on his set. In 1976, one of the most iconic events occurred. Carson's cigarette box on the desk was smashed when he went to get a cigarette while hosting The Tonight Show as normal. The offender? Don Rickles, who was guest hosting the previous evening. Carson did something uncommon for late-night television without skipping a beat. He walked across the hall to the studio where Rickles was filming his sitcom CPO Sharkey after leaving the set during the performance, and interrupted the live recording. As Carson faced him directly in front of the crowd, they roared. Rickles pretended to be innocent before making the entire situation humorous by begging Carson and joking that he was only trying to support himself. But the scene, which wonderfully encapsulated their relationship, went down in television history as a legendary moment. In 1978, 2 years later, Rickles once again took front stage. Carson's anniversary special, this time. Rickles turned the late-night celebration of Carson's reign into one of his signature roasts as the entire nation tuned in. Joking that Johnny changed brides the way most people changed vehicles, he made fun of Carson's fortune and numerous marriages. With his trademark smile and cigarette in hand, Carson sat there and let Rickles have his way. It demonstrated that Carson had enough faith in him to take risks that few people could. Every time he performed on the show, Rickles flourished in physical humor as well. During a comedic routine in one well-known sketch, Carson was reclining on a massage table. Rickles appeared out of nowhere, interrupting the moment. He gave the scene his all, manhandling Carson and transforming the serene scene into a comedic frenzy. Despite his best efforts to remain in character, Carson couldn't help but giggle when the audience burst into laughter. The unexpected appearances were ingrained in Rickles' mythology. He did more than only respond to inquiries while seated in the chair. He made each visit a celebration. There was always a harsh but loving teasing between the two. Rickles would taunt Carson about his vast fortune, accusing him of living like a king while posing as a common man. He ridiculed Carson's shortcomings and made jokes about his succession of marriages while feigning to give him love advice. The cadence between them was so organic that it frequently felt more like two old friends joking at dinner than like a late-night interview. Carson, on the other hand, leant back and let the insults bounce off him, portraying the cool, slightly irritated straight man. However, there was more to The Tonight Show than just the laughing. Johnny Carson had legendary control over the show. He kept a firm hold on who was allowed to occupy that guest chair while letting Rickles go wild on TV. Many entertainers and comedians were aware that Carson's acceptance or rejection of a single invitation could make or ruin a career. Others were even afraid of his impact. Carson's influence over guest reservations was made clear by a number of high-profile occurrences. Once a frequent guest presenter and someone he had personally coached, Joan Rivers was given a permanent ban from The Tonight Show after starting her own late-night show without telling him beforehand. Never again spoke to her, and the prohibition persisted until his passing. In a different instance, impressionist Rich Little was accused of being blacklisted by Carson for making fun of him too much while performing. Rickles was aware of the limits, even though he could get away with making fun of Carson in public. He was allowed to make light of Johnny's distance on camera, calling him stiff or too serious. However, off camera, Carson was regarded as a very different person, cold, aloof, and frequently disinterested in making friends with his visitors. According to numerous celebs who attended the show, Carson was kind but aloof once the cameras stopped rolling. He tended to withdraw into his own world after the taping was over and hardly ever spoke with anyone backstage. Rickles and Carson's relationship was special because of this dynamic. Rickles had a chance to make an impression on Johnny Shell, at least on stage, unlike many of the other visitors. Because they thought they were witnessing a side of Carson that no one else could, the audience adored it. Carson's occasional episodes of losing his equilibrium frequently occurred only when Rickles was around, and the laughing was sincere. One of the enduring characteristics of late-night television is that chemistry. Despite how much the public adored their connection on film, Carson's smile belied a much more nuanced reality. He was more than simply the late-night monarch. Few others ever saw the private demons he carried. Carson's personal troubles. There was a man with tremendous demons behind Johnny Carson's cool grin and shrewd timing. He appeared invincible on TV, the late-night comedy king who made America laugh. His life was a completely different narrative away from the cameras. One characterized by personal tragedy, shattered marriages, and an almost insatiable craving for control. Carson was married 4 times, and almost all of those marriages had problems. Jody Walcott, who later described violent outbursts and emotional abuse driven by alcohol, was the victim of his first disastrous marriage. Jody frequently perceived him as a man who may be erratic and intimidating, despite the fact that audiences found him to be a lovely presenter. Drinking in Carson's fury led to an unstable home life that was short-lived. It was not much simpler when he married Joanne Copeland for the second time. Joanne talked candidly about Carson's drinking, recounting instances in which he had blackouts and displayed what she described as extreme rage against women. She showed Carson a side that few outsiders ever saw, a guy whose fears frequently manifested themselves destructively. The strain of those personal issues ultimately caused the marriage to fail, just like the previous. Despite all of his accomplishments, Carson's personal life hardly ever seemed steady. Although he continued to advance professionally, he battled intimacy, rage, and trust behind the scenes. Alcohol was a factor, frequently making the problems that were already simmering beneath the surface worse. Every marriage seems to go through a similar cycle of romance, strife, and dissolution. As a father, Carson also experienced tragedy. Richard, his 39-year-old son, lost his life in an automobile accident in 1991. While traveling along the California coast, Richard, a photographer, was involved in an accident. Despite the terrible loss, Carson decided not to go to the funeral. He said that by being there, a private family event would become a public spectacle and attract a lot of media attention. This choice demonstrated how much he struggled to reconcile his private pain and public persona. At his core, Carson was a very quiet and solitary individual, even though he was the most recognizable man in America every night. He disliked having lengthy interactions with guests once the cameras stopped filming, rarely went to Hollywood parties, and tended to withdraw into his own secluded world. His co-workers frequently characterized him as reserved, even reclusive, after the limelight was removed. He enjoyed having control over his environment, and his fixation with control permeated almost every aspect of his existence. Carson discovered unconventional ways to let go of some of his bottled-up energy. One of his favorite activities became tennis, a sport that required self-control, discipline, and attention. He also enjoyed playing the drums, and he frequently withdrew to practice in order to express his feelings. He was able to handle the aspects of himself that seemed uncontrollable in relationships thanks to the framework these pastimes provided. Because of his contradictory life, Carson was both intriguing and challenging to comprehend. On TV, he could make millions laugh with a single gesture, but at home, his rage and disengagement caused his marriages to fail. Although the public loved him, he was a recluse in private and frequently distanced himself from even his closest friends and family. His bond with Don Rickles became more complex as a result of all of this. Rickles made light of Carson's affluence, his distance, and his marriages on TV. Although the audience perceived it as humor, there was some reality hidden beneath the jokes. It contributed to the explosive nature of their banter, but it also sowed the seeds of tension that would eventually result in their own private fallout. Fallout between Rickles and Carson. Despite their on-screen chemistry entertaining audiences, Don Rickles and Johnny Carson's friendship was not immune to animosity. By the time Carson departed from The Tonight Show in 1992, Rickles felt he was a logical choice to take over because of his extensive tenure on the show and his indisputable rapport with viewers. The notion of Rickles ascending to the late-night throne may have looked out of the ordinary to many, but it seemed rightful to Rickles. That anticipation was never fulfilled. A younger comic with a completely different approach, Jay Leno, was given the show by NBC. Executives thought that Leno's safe and affable demeanor would maintain high ratings, and he had established himself as a stand-up comedian who catered to Middle America. The decision behind the scenes wasn't only based on humor. It was about corporate strategy, demographics, and business. But it was personal to Rickles. He was said to be deeply resentful of the passing over. During those years, Rickles publicly criticized Carson, according to friends and co-workers, calling him a traitor. According to reports, he accused Carson of lying to him about giving him hope for the position. Rickles believed that the man who had performed with him for decades, who had repeatedly brought him back to the couch and smiled at his taunts, had deserted him just when the greatest chance was at his fingertips. Rickles was not merely disappointed. He thought their friendship had been based more on television appearances than on true loyalty, and had been more performance than substance. Rickles had always thought their relationship was different, even though Carson's hostility off-camera was well known in Hollywood. Finding out otherwise, or at least thinking so, was a wound that never really went away. Rickles carried the resentment with him while Carson relished his retirement. The topic of Carson's retirement caused obvious annoyance, despite the fact that he performed, made appearances on talk shows, and enjoyed popularity far into his senior years. According to insider accounts, the animosity persisted subtly and influenced his reflections on his decades in show business. Rickles kept up the old cadence for audiences who recalled their glory days by making jokes about Carson in public. However, the light-hearted barbs concealed genuine rage. He frequently made hints that the friendship portrayed on film was more of a contrived performance than a genuine one. Not distant from the cameras was the love that seemed so real beneath the studio lights. As the years passed, Rickles' sentiments towards Carson shifted from rivalry to disappointment. In the end, he felt abandoned by the man who had been such a constant in his career. Rickles was still affected by that aftermath when Carson's health started to deteriorate in the early 2000s. Once a focal point of television humor, their relationship had broken down. And all that was left was a tense mixture of appreciation for Carson's skill and bitterness about how things turned out. For Rickles, the time of Carson's death in 2005 was all the more poignant because of that complex past. While the world lamented the death of the king of late night, Rickles saw it as the end of a chapter that was full of unresolved anguish and joy. An era's end. Few performers ever leave The Tonight Show with the grace that Johnny Carson did on his last night in 1992, yet during the next years, his visibility gradually diminished. Carson decided to spend his latter years in almost complete seclusion, rarely appeared on television, and rarely gave interviews. The man who had once been America's nightly companion was living a peaceful life by the early 2000s, resembling a specter of his former life in show business. That chapter ultimately came to an end on January 23. Passed away at the age of 79 from emphysema complications. The entertainment industry was rocked by the news. Carson had been retired for nearly 10 years, yet his impact continued to loom large over late-night television, influencing all of his successors. The loss was more than the death of a single man, it was the end of a cultural period. The Tonight Show honored its former monarch the very following night, January 24. For the man who had constructed the home he now lived, Jay Leno, who had acquired Carson's chair, broke away from his customary monologue-heavy structure. People who had worked alongside Carson, laughed with him, and performed on stage with him throughout those defining decades were all reunited in this episode. Bob Newhart, Carson's frequent sidekick Ed McMahon, and Don Rickles were there. Together, they honored Carson's influence on humor in general as well as his profession. After years of conflicted sentiments for Carson, Rickles embraced the tribute with unexpected affection. He said bluntly on ABC that Carson was the best straight man a comedian could ask for. He went on to say that Carson was a complex genius, a description that encapsulated the man's split personality as an aloof figure in private life and a superb host on stage. It was not a sweet farewell. Rickles didn't act as though there had never been any tensions or that their friendship had been perfect. Rather, he made the decision to respect Carson by acknowledging both his talents and his complexity. It was significant since it came from Rickles, who was never afraid to be honest and showed that he still valued Carson's achievements. The tribute show itself served as a reminder on how much people will miss Carson. With the respect of a man who had lost a partner as well as a boss, Ed McMahon, who had been with him for 30 years, spoke. Another comic legend, Bob Newhart, thought back to the many evenings when Carson's program was the beating heart of America. In his own way, Rickles also reminded the audience that Carson's brilliance lay not just in his jokes but also in the room he made for others to shine. It was a bittersweet time for Rickles. He had been teasing Carson on TV for decades, pointing fingers at his money, his marriages, and his coldness. It had been well received by audiences, and Carson himself had appeared to like it. However, beneath those giggles was always the feeling that their friendship never quite developed to the extent that many had thought it would. More than just a life was lost with Carson's passing. It's signaling the end of an entertainment era. Even in retirement, no one could really replace him because he had defined late-night television for 30 years. In his shadow stood every subsequent host, including Leno, Letterman, Conan, and others. The loss was very personal to Don Rickles. It served as a reminder of his own mortality as well as the passing of the American comedy generation that once dominated popular culture. Do you believe that The Tonight Show should have allowed Don Rickles to host? Tell us in the space provided for comments below. Remember to click on the next video that appears on your screen if you liked this one. For further updates, please subscribe to our channel and like this video.